The ideological onslaught was accompanied by longer-term social and cultural changes. The assumption of Marx that the industrial working class was the basis for socialism had been adopted by the mass parties of the left since the late 19th century. However, there was now much discussion as to whether such parties could survive if they were tied to this sector of the population. The claim was that the working class was in decline. At the beginning of the 1970s, 42% of the workforce of the European community worked in blue-collar manufacturing industry. By 1990, 60% were employed in the service sector and only 32.5% in industry. And by the beginning of the 21st century, only 16% were in manufacturing industry, while over 75% were employed in the service sector or knowledge-producing industries. This was coupled with a rise in the female workforce, which had reached nearly 40% of the total workforce in 1988, with nearly 75% of women workers in the service sector. The private service sector was less unionized than industry, as was part-time work, in which there had been an increase, mainly among women. In the UK, unionization declined sharply from its peak of 55.4% in 1979 to 37.7% in 1990 and was only 30% by 1997. This picture was not consistent across all countries. As noted in Chapter 2, Sweden certainly defied the downward trend in trade union membership, and trade union density also remained above 70% in Denmark and Finland. Nevertheless, the rise in the service sector and part-time and temporary work was general across all the advanced industrial countries. This was coupled with a shift from the kinds of living and working conditions that were historically associated with the labor movement. The general trend was towards more atomized employment and the dispersal of traditional working-class communities. Such changes were connected with developments that have already been discussed. The growth of the service sector was expedited by the US-led move to free capital movements and the consequent strengthening of the role of private transnational corporations and monetary institutions. In Britain, at least, the decline in unions, dominated by militant manual workers, was sometimes deliberately engineered by the government, most notably in the confrontation with the miners in 1984-1985. The general power of trade unions was also reduced by institutional changes. Again, this was most obvious in Britain, when the Thatcher government simply removed the Trade Union Congress from its previous position as a privileged interlocutor in policy discussions. Yet even apparently progressive reforms aimed at improving working conditions, such as those of the first Mitterrand socialist government in France, tended to undermine the power of the organized working class, where the already low trade union density of 17.5% in 1980 had dropped to 9.8% 10 years later. Naturally, there has been a sharp debate amongst socialists and, more particularly, Marxists as to whether any of the above changes mean that there has been a decline in the working class. It may be argued, on the contrary, that there has been an increase as people in the service sector and the professions have been proletarianized, and the agricultural and self-employed sectors have declined. There is, therefore, a far higher percentage of people who live by selling their labor power for wages than has ever been the case before. In theory, all forms of salaried employees may be viewed as part of a single class. There is no reason why male blue-collar workers should have been objectified as the working class, and there are many good reasons, as noted in Chapter 3, for condemning the fact that, historically, this has been the tendency in labor movements. However, there is considerable evidence to suggest that in practice, the working class, however defined, was becoming more segmented. Interunion rivalries tended to grow. Union alignments with social democratic parties weakened. There was an increasing tendency to class de-alignment, and there was also a reduction in people's self-perception as working class. Defining all these groups as working class did not mean that they would act in the ways predicted by Marx or even by social democrats. As Jeff Ely has put it, contemporary transformations were not the death of class or the end of the working class per se. They were the passing of one type of class society, the one that was marked by working class formation between the 1880s and 1940s, and the resulting political alignments with its apogee in the post-war settlement. As long-term changes in the economy combined with the attack on Keynesianism, the unity of the working class ceased to be available in that old and well-tried form as the natural ground of left-wing politics.